All right, Gene Sticco, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
I was reading some of your Substack, and you got some super fascinating stuff on there. Some of it I think might be a little bit over my head, but some a really good the one that you posted just a few days ago about the state of disclosure right now was really interesting. I thought. Um, Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say appreciate it. Those are that sort of became my hobby. Let's say out of aside from the the main work I'm doing, just trying to figure out how to put some structure around everything that is talked about in the community. I really only came into this less than a year, 9 months ago, probably at this point.
No, really.
Um, and it's like drinking through a fire hose, right? And you don't know you don't know what's real. You don't know, what's opinion a lot of times. And so it's, that whole Substack just sort of grew out of, I think, just me trying to figure out for myself, what was to separate signal from noise, as they say.
Yeah, it's very just meticulously presented, and I really highly recommend anybody check it out too. And in addition to what we'll talk about, was your book, Engineering Infinity. But first off, I guess we should get a little bit of background on. Can you give us a little background on yourself and how you became interested in this topic? You said it was not too very long ago, so.
Yeah, so I got interested in it basically out of necessity. So my entire career, I was started out in the U.S. Air Force. Went into did it served for about 9 years. Went into government contracting in intelligence within the oil and gas industry specifically. So that was my focal point. Lived overseas the majority of my career, as well as traveling all over the place, doing, as I categorize it, geopolitical and transnational security risk management
Mm-hmm.
around oil and gas infrastructure. And basically retired in 2017. Had met my wife, my current wife, shortly thereafter, Natalia, who was from Riga, Latvia. We married in 2018, moved to the U.S. later that year. At the end of 2019, her father, who had lived in Kazakhstan, passed away. And right before he had passed away, he sent a bunch of stuff, as far as we knew, for our son, my stepson, who at the time was about 9 years old, and he was interested in aircraft and airplanes, all that good stuff. And Natalia's father was an aerospace engineer during the years of the Soviet Union. So he casually says to her, "I'm going to send you some things I used to work on for AJ, our son." Arrived, sat there within weeks. He had gotten sick, and by December 30th, was dead, 2019. And it was after that that we looked at what he sent. And long story short on that, it was 119 pages of detailed schematics in engineering and physics that was describing the reverse engineering of a UFO. And that's what set us off on the journey. Between trying to figure out what that was in the time between 2020 and ultimately late 2024 when I finally published it. We translated no notes, we published it, both because of what we were finding or what I was finding, in sort of trying to figure out, is there any legitimacy to this stuff? And, as something to put out to the community, because I started looking, well, what's going on? And I'm like, I think this can answer a lot of things. Let me put it out there and see if anybody can figure it out. And that's really what started this.
Wow, what a serendipitous thing that was. Then, the book seems like completely fascinating. Now, who is the is very also very technical.
Yes.
Who was the scientist that I can't
Yeah,
pronounce his name.
yeah. So that's my father-in-law. His name's Valery Chernohayeva
Okay.
or Chernohayev. So my wife is Chernohayeva. So Valeris Chernohayev. And we've sadly learned or figured out more about him since he's died than my wife ever knew that while he was alive. In reality, that's been part of this story as well, as sort of unraveling bits and pieces of things that she knew or heard, or that when she went back now and thought through things again, is painting a different picture of who the man was.
That's kind of cool though, because that's that's kind of like getting to know someone after they're gone like that. That you've actually gotten, you got more time with them.
Yeah, I mean, I probably talked to him 2-3 times via video.
Mm-hmm.
I always described it. I always knew he was a diehard communist, still longing for the days of the Soviet Union, and of course, he didn't really know the depth of my background because I had
Mm-hmm.
contracted at one point, with CIA, Department of Energy, worked with DIA, all the big 3-letter agencies. Um, but he didn't really, he didn't know any of that at the time. And so we used to, he obviously knew I was an American, I was a veteran, I was a patriot, he was a diehard communist. So, we'd have a lot of laughs around that.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, to think, had we dove into it before he died, had we, known, if he was still alive and could actually, give details and fill in the blanks, it would just be, amazing.
Yeah, well, having grown up during that era of, in the late '70s and the early '80s and stuff, when the Soviet Union and the U.S. It was all the time on the news, and we were getting ready for nuclear war at all times, and they had,
Right.
the things like that. I was just thinking about the other day how there was a whole sort of genre, and I was a part of being interested in that as a kid, of like this sort of behind the Iron Curtain type of stuff, where there was a lot of stuff about East Berlin and things like that, and the whole Soviet, the USSR period was like almost, I mean, people in America almost knew nothing about it anyway, other than
Right.
other than TV, like they're the bad guys type of thing. We didn't really know that much about it because they kept so secret. So I think it's fascinating. Like the only thing I remember seeing UFO wise come out of there, and this was in about 1989 or so, and I still have the article to this day that I had clipped out of the newspaper, and it somehow made to UPI or AP or something, and it was about a craft that had landed in a park, and then there was some sort of beings that got off the craft and then made some boy disappear or something like that. It was like this real crazy
Oh,
story
no
that,
kidding. Yeah.
yeah, and I remember thinking, oh, how wild that was, and it's just one of the ones I saved, from a long time ago. And I was talking to someone about it recently, and they had no memory of it. But then I started seeing a couple things about that one. But that was one of the things one of the few things that slipped out basically from the Soviet Union to the West, where we, saw that they had also had a UFO thing going. So tell me what did you find out as far as this was actually like ARV type of thing?
So in the documents himself, he specifically refers to the craft as the UFO. So it's, directly calling it the UFO. He makes references to another craft, a much larger craft that was recently in Earth's atmosphere. So, it doesn't, the language that he uses doesn't indicate that it's supposed to be a reproduction. The language he uses is not, he's guessing, he's thinking. It's very specific, it's very direct. It's these are the measurements. This is what it does. This is how it works. And he's trying to use the math and the physics that he has to explain it. So it's, at different points over the 5 years, or 4 years of trying to investigate it. I would take some of the screenshots of the math, the physics, and send it to some people we knew who would understand, and some would reference it and say, yeah, this is kind of old, or nah, the numbers are wrong and things like that, but they wouldn't have the full context of the entire document. It was just for me to gauge how legit may or may not this thing be. So when they were coming back saying, yeah, but the numbers aren't right, what he uses isn't correct, well, that's because what he was doing was trying to fit in the observations and whatever measurements he could make and adjust the math accordingly.
So was there any indication of where this came from? Was this like was it designed by in the Soviet Union? Was it based off of something else?
So he doesn't talk about the source of it, that it came from any place or whatever. Again, these are like his notes, right? That
Mm-hmm.
his drafts of other things. And I always said from the beginning, it looks like it's likely part of a much larger body of work that would exist elsewhere. So no, he doesn't get into anything that gives any kind of clues as to where it came from. Now, what there are clues of is as he's describing the materials, as he's working through the physics. At one point, he specifically says, "This is 22nd century technology."
Mm.
So he reaches this, he's going through all this stuff, and then he's like, "But we can't do any of this. This is 22nd century technology." I'm explaining it, the best I can. That's sort of the, reading between the lines takeaway on that phrasing that he uses.
So, but there was a working craft like that they knew.
It doesn't say whether it was working or not. The all of the number of times I've run through the various assessments, it seems from like an engineering perspective that he is laying out the build document. So these would have fit into some sort of build a document on how to get this thing working.
Well, can you describe the craft itself and like what the capabilities and maybe what it physically looked like?
Yeah, so all those, the schematics are right in the book itself. I can pull it out and show it if you'd like. But, essentially it is, I guess, best described as a top hat shaped craft, about 30 meters in diameter. Its hull is made up of a silicone and ferrodynamic, ferro something, shell. It's essentially constructed in two pieces. It has a compact thermonuclear power system that uses heavy water, deuterium, and feeds into a 32 solenoid array, and that generates the electrical charge, converts it to plasma, generates the electrical charge. The hull itself becomes part of the power and energy system. It is operated by, and that system generates both a magnetic and a gravitational field around the craft, and then the pilot of the craft brings the third element, which is a consciousness element, in which the pilot and the pilot's ability to access what my father-in-law described as the information energy field then allows him to manipulate four panels. So there's four quadrant panel system that rests right below the craft and adjusts ever so lightly, to change the craft's position within this field that it has generated. And that is how the craft navigates and moves, between fields. And he describes that as somehow being within what used to be called the ether, or is more, I guess, now talked about in terms of being the structured vacuum. And so it moves through that, by changing positions within this field that it's established for itself to navigate. And it goes
Wow.
into more details on the specifics of the effects, between the moon and the planets and their gravitational fields and all the rest of it. But that's sort of my understanding of it at the high level.
Wow. That's a pretty. It kind of goes along with. I was just talking to Grant Cameron, and he was talking about the ships, and then how people would like claim to have like had control of these craft at some point, and the consciousness aspect of that, to where that the pilot, it was really like that there wasn't any like levers or buttons or switches or anything like that, but that they sort of tapped into it, and it would instantaneously like basically do whatever their command was.
Right. Somebody else had described it as moving at the speed of thought.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's
And
a good one.
yeah, that's pretty consistent. So, that's what I'm saying. When, these were written in the 80s, 90s, there might have been some parts of it that I can arguably say would have extended to 2007 at the latest. But, primarily the body of it was, 80s and 90s. And again, in the Soviet Union, right? So we're eh, talking pre-internet, never mind what we know as, information flow in and
Mm-hmm.
out, through the Iron Curtain, what that was like at the time. So, it's, the document, the science, all that's internally consistent, but it's also very consistent with the decades of what we see, reported, what we see come out in declassified documents, and the science that is developed after that period. And again, these are all the sorts of correlations and things that I've been diving into, not only since we got it, but particularly since I've sort of jumped into this community to begin sharing it, and for myself to also learn what's out there, and what people have done or talked about, and what other documentation is available. So it's very consistent with all of these ideas and theories that go out there. And I'll often say to people, it's like, and I don't want to sound arrogant in the sense of saying anybody's wrong, but it's like when I hear things and I assess it, I'm like, you're right, but for the wrong reasons. Let me, here's some additional structure that can go behind what you have to say. But generally, people, happy with the way they've reached conclusions and don't want anything that challenges the way they reach the conclusion, even though it's still going to get them there. you know.
Yeah. Well, I think the problem is that there's so much conflicting evidence when it comes to the subject of the UFO UAP phenomenon that you can make, in other words, you can make a very strong case for crash retrievals, and for like the U.S. government having bodies of aliens and things like this. you can make a very strong case for that. And you can also make a very strong case that the whole thing is somehow interdimensional and there is no physical aspect of it. That this is something that's happening. It's not that it's not real, but it's something that's happening, in reality, that is not that's always been here and is not really, it is more, it's less alien and more, part of this
Yep. Part of
world.
nature. Yep.
You can make a very strong case for that. And so you end up with a lot of very, or at least seemingly on the surface, very conflicting reports, and it's hard to make sense of it, especially for people who have just kind of gotten into this as a subject,
Yeah.
and then of course there are, people who, like you said, they have a sort of a pet theory on it, and they're not going to go anywhere except for that pet theory, and they're just really looking for, it's confirmation bias type of thing.
Exactly. Right. And that's why I agree. And the thing about it, and when I go through, my father-in-law's stuff as a package, it's, all these different things, they're not contradictory. They're actually complementary to one another. And there's a broader answer than it being one or the other. It's, again, they're right, but for the wrong reasons. That it's a combination of all of these things. I've gotten in when they've talked about plasma and orbs, and the vehicles are alive themselves and they're shape shifting. No, they're the hull of the craft is part of the energy, and the way it transitions between the ether and can cause the optical illusions that we're seeing, can cause what we're able to record. It's just we're recording things and capturing things our brains are not able to process. And so, when they see it, people then get tied into their own dogma and their own interpretation of it, rather than being able to accept it's a combination of things and
Mm-hmm.
not just one thing in particular.
Yeah, well, that's what I've come to believe over the years, that there's more than one thing going on, and that
Yeah.
an explanation for it might not, neatly fit into one of our preconceived, like, we want it to fit into something that we're already familiar with, and that just might not be the case. That just might not be how it is. I remember hearing someone compare or make the sort of comparison to that book Flat World, like where
Yep.
there was like the book where there's the people live only on a 2D plane, or and the only two-dimensional universe, and then something from a three-dimensional universe comes in, and when it comes into the 2D universe, it doesn't look like what it looks like in the three-dimensional universe. So in other words,
Right.
they were saying that maybe the craft come from a different sort of like extra dimensional type of I'm not really sure how to describe that, but
Plane. Yeah.
yeah, but when it comes in, you're seeing what you're seeing, is not the full reality of it. So therefore, that's why that would be what it would explain, like, these sudden appearances or disappearances, or sometimes when they'll see them and they'll kind of dot through the sky like that, like almost skip through the sky, and the
Yeah.
odd behavior.
Yeah. Exactly. And I've actually had this discussion argument with academics who say, well, whatever part of the my father-in-law's work, they said, well, that's impossible. Da da da. I'm like, well, now you're being not only academically disingenuous but intellectually disingenuous, because if you expect there is a craft that was created somewhere not on Earth, whether it's whatever it is, if you expect that it's going to, land on the White House lawn and you're going to go up there with your Craftsman tool set and be able to disassemble and reassemble it, and it's going to work and operate, exactly within some framework that you already say we know, then you are setting yourself up for failure. Then you are, you should expect that I'm not going to know anything about this craft. I am not going to understand anything about what this craft is or how it operates or what it was. That's the mindset, I think, as a scientist you need to go into. And then if you do understand it, you should be grateful and start from, and
Yeah,
start from that.
yeah, it's what like I think it was Jacques Vallée that said it would be like taking a cell phone and dropping it down in front of somebody in the 16th century or something. Like there's no way you could. There's it's not even approachable as a piece of technology that you would recognize. And that
Exactly.
could that yeah, that could very well be the case. Do you run across anything about the Soviets and any commentary or anything about them, what they thought of our program or like the legacy program?
Well, it's interesting. So, as I look back and compared the history and sort of the decisions that the U.S. made and the decisions that the Soviet Union made, and then through independence and to modern Russia and the rest of it. But if we take that sort of core starting point in the 1940s, post World War II, the Russians always had a very different approach to the phenomenon than the United States did. Right? We went into instant denial, if not it's probably the Soviets, or could it be the Soviets, or could it be the Chinese? And we've sort of maintained that narrative through the decades. But
I
in
was
the
going to say we're kind of
1940s,
still doing that. Yeah.
yeah, we're still doing it, right? The 1940s and 50s, the Russians never acted like it was the United States. They
Mm-hmm.
never pretended that it could be a threat from the West. And there was even a on Moscow Public Radio. I think it was like in 1953. There was a chat show, a discussion where they were saying how ridiculous the United States was to be sitting there making comments that this is potentially the Soviet Union, and advanced technology out of Russia. And they were like, why would they, why are they saying that? Are they saying it just to sort of promulgate, conflict and suspicion and this and that? So it was very two different strategies. As we saw, or as evidence through George Knapp's, evidence he brought back from Russia, they went into creating a joint program between their major academic institutions and the military to collect evidence, to process it, to figure it out what it was. They brought all the right agencies to the table. What the US do, we created the national security state, and we created a lot of government institutions, and we compartmentalized and distributed lots of bits and pieces for scientific research out through the decades. But we never had, and still don't have, a transparent level of where anything might have been integrated and consolidated. So again, I think historically very two very different. Now, granted, I guess we have to account for the Soviet Union had much better controls over information in a overall sense, right? They didn't have that nasty freedom of speech thing like we do, or
Mm-hmm.
they didn't have all those roadblocks that the U.S. government did when it came to disseminating what is national security information and what can be controlled and can't be controlled in the press. And I guess we have to give credit for that, or take that into account too as we look at it.
Yeah, it's interesting the two different approaches because, of course, being a much more closed society, it seems like just being that closed of a society as the USSR was, would kind of indicates a certain amount of paranoia, But at the same time, because they were such a closed society, they apparently distributing this information more liberally amongst their universities and people like that. Huh?
Right. Well, right. That's sort of the what is it, the juxtaposition, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
between the two. It's something, I talk a little bit with Paul Stonehill, a UFO, Russian ufology, expert, and he's wonderful depth of knowledge, deep into the history of it. And I think that's what the sort of Western, the U.S. focused ufology circle and circuit underappreciates, right? That information was so tightly controlled, the state line, across the board on all sorts of topics. They controlled the arts and art that could be created. It had to be created for the purposes that furthered the state, right? Everything that was done, even my father-in-law's work, right? He would have been a young engineer working on the project, and he would have turned it over to a superior, and that superior turns it over to the next, and nobody puts their name on it. Nobody takes ownership of it. No one takes ownership of the discovery or the science, because it's all for the benefit of Mother Russia, right? And just the fact that you're able to do that. So, when you've got an issue like UFO phenomenon that is broadly and widely able to be discussed, both within government circles and academic circles, within society, that people, share the stories, that they don't seem like it's a surprise thing. That is quite different from everything else, information wise, in that Soviet structure that was done, which I think makes it all the more noteworthy and worthy of deeper exploration and understanding, even within the context of what we look at here in the U.S.
Mm-hmm. So, like I said, I was reading about you were talking about disclosure here in the U.S. and on the topic of our impenetrable, legacy programs and the history that we've got now since the 40s of all of these things, like with the crashes or supposed crashes, everything from Roswell to the Kecksburg, Pennsylvania, to
Mm.
the New Mexico one is ones I'm thinking about, that always end up, at least the folklore at least is that they ended up in a Air Force base like Edwards or
Right,
somewhere like
Patterson?
that. You're right, Patterson. I was in Ohio, and that long story short, I guess, on that is that they ended up in those places, and then all the material or anything that was collected, any ships or any pieces of ships or anything like that, ended up in the hands of Northrop Grumman or Raytheon or whatever military industrial complex company that you want to, and then all that being that it's in their hands, then it's private industry and it's no longer subject to like FOIA requests and things like this,
Right.
which has made it so. I think that's the main problem, I guess, with getting to the bottom of what's real and what's not, is because we don't really have access to that. So, where do you think we are right now with this disclosure, and what do you think disclosure would mean at this point?
Yeah, so I'll start with that. What would disclosure mean at this point? Disclosure would mean that there's a full accounting for the materials that were recovered, by the United States government, and then what was done with them, and where they went. We can't. You're right. I always said the next biggest firewall after declassification becomes intellectual property, and trying to get it, squeeze it out of any private contractors that got the benefit of these materials. And I think, but the way it was structured, it was funny. I was on something with Tim Phillips, the former acting Arrow director, who retired, and he had written in the back chat. He says, the U.S. government does not possess any UFO materials or technologies, and I believe him 100%. Right, the U.S. government does not. But what about contractors and universities and all the rest of it?
Mm-hmm.
That it's what you don't say that sometimes matter, or what the government doesn't say that sometimes matters more than what they actually do say. Um, I think this is all coming to an head now because several factors are in play. Right, obviously it's the camera and video in everybody's pocket. You just can't ignore those numbers of videos, and that many questions becomes unmanageable at some point. And I think they've recognized that for several years. Um, I think what has happened and where we're at now, where the disclosure discussion becomes a little bit easier, perhaps, for the government, is the fact that private industry has probably got very advanced exotic products that were derived originally from some of this NHI technology, or we just say recovered materials,
Mm-hmm.
to play it simple, and that we have lost so much institutional knowledge of the origins, right? Because people rotate in and out of positions, they begin to retire. Somebody that's been with a company for 35 years now and worked deep within their scientific research division very likely does not know the origins of the program and the materials that they've been working on. Because when they started 35 years ago on this program, oh, yeah, we had this stuff for 10, 15 years before that,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Or
That,
decades before that.
yeah, but you know what I'm saying? But when you come
Mm-hmm.
into a job and it's like, okay, this is something we've been working on the last 15 years. Okay, great. Here it is. Wow. And then you just start going forward. And nobody says, well, so how did that start 15 years ago? Right? Because at that point, it doesn't matter how it started 15 years ago. I have a job to do right now that I'm writing, they're writing me a check for. So I just need to worry about taking it forward.
Right. And
And
also,
there's never any.
knowledge is
Yeah,
so compartmentalized too that, like, you know.
yeah, well, exactly. Oh, we got this 15 years ago. Where'd you get it from? Oh, it came from this agency. Oh, okay. And then they just got a job to do. So that's the beauty of the compartmentalization. So I think, yes, we are literally at a point now that when somebody in government, Burleson or whatever, goes into a place and they say, we've had this 25 years, we've had this 30 years, right? It's, to them, it's no big, yes, it's exotic, it's sexy, it looks great. But I can explain to you what has, how this has matured over the last 35 years. Number one, nobody's going to sit and listen to that, right? And number two, then if it needs to go, are they cognizant enough to say, all right, so you gave, we're at day 135 years ago. Now, how did it get from that? Where did that start? This is all an origin story, is where I'm getting at with it. That, we can break down, we've got to keep asking why and from where were things developed. Part of the work I'm doing as well, with my father-in-law's works, because for me, the utility of them is that they are a timestamp and they are a benchmark. So there's approximately 42 different scientific domains that he covers in these works. So that gives me in science a starting point where I could say, okay, so before 1980, 1981, what was the progression of this particular line of science? What would he have known in 1980? And then I can go to 2000 or 2007 and say, where has it gone since then? Another point I like to start from post Chernobyl, my father-in-law, is 1996, because that is where, when the majority of brain drain came from the former Soviet Union, that's when the formal program of establishing visas for former Russian scientists was at its peak in the United States. That's where a lot of them came over. Within 5 months, they had top secret clearances and were working through NASA and throughout the Department of Defense, mostly in the Navy and the Air Force. So we have these temporal markers in the timeline that we can measure, that we can see what is the normal scale of advancement for science in general, and then for these domains in particular, and compare them against alternate or adjacent domains. And consistently, as I do that, I find that the ones that are specific to this body of work, which describes the reverse engineering of a UFO, move exponentially faster than any others. I don't have an answer for it, and that's where I come down to, if Congress is looking for, if they are lacking questions to ask of substance, this provides a whole bunch of substantive questions and lines of investigation that should be pursued if the agencies and entities that be are not being forthright and cooperative. And then it gives you a basis to measure the answers against too.
Hmm.
Does it fit?
To see, yeah, because I think a lot of people are coming to the conclusion that there's like science, um, a lot of a lot of physics, at least, has appeared to be rather stagnant in recent decades. That
Sure.
and really, and the last big movement in physics, if you will, that was string theory, and then that came about in like the early '80s or something, rose to its to being sort of popular science by like the 1990s and early 2000s and stuff, but it's never produced any actual results or any verifiable like laboratory experiments or anything like that. It's basically philosophy really at that point. And so what, in other words, I think that's that Eric Weinstein, like, always talks about that a lot. Like,
Yep.
so, for that reason, like, where did the rest of science, where did the science go? Like,
Right.
where, because I know everybody wasn't working on that one thing that wasn't producing any results, so, the other lines that could have possibly kept going. One thing, as you were talking, it just kind of occurred to me that, because I just don't think that most people, and I'm a person that's been into that subject of UFOs and for decades, so
Hmm.
I know next to nothing about the Russian, space program, or secret space program. Do you know if they had if they have had a lot of activity around nuclear facilities like we have in America?
Absolutely consistent. That's I think Mystery Wire, George Knapp recently covered. their primary nuclear incident where the craft, as opposed to the Malmstrom incident, some of the ones in the U.S. where they get turned off, it was 1982, and the missiles got turned on and went into launch sequence, and nobody could do anything to stop it. And there was, no keys were turned, no buttons were pushed, but the countdown and the fire up was initiated, and then just stopped suddenly. And that's probably one of the bigger near misses or incidents that were occurred. There were stories, again, the directives that the Ministry of Defense gave to pilots to engage the craft, shoot them down. Soviet pilots had the wings taken off of their vehicles or off of their aircraft, and ultimately that decision was reversed, and it was like, observe and do not engage, do not attempt to engage. There's another story that, again, gets a little more fantastical, but again, the craft landed. Russian forces, I think this was in Ukraine, Russian forces attempted to engage the beings on the craft, and they fired, the craft fired some sort of weapon that essentially turned the soldiers into stone. There's reports that there was another incident where there was some sort of weapon that seemed to had been identified. The Russians were able to fire it once, but never get it working again. And then of course there's Chernobyl, 1986, where there are some reports of unidentified craft being over and around the facility in the days leading up to it, the meltdown. Then the meltdown occurred, and I think one of the more famous ones was there was a craft observed over that reactor 4 of Chernobyl afterwards. And, I mentioned that because it was something, because we hadn't heard about it really recently, these, this craft over nuke bases and all the rest of it. I had that was something I threw on a timeline one time, and sort of thought, again, the instances of unidentified craft interfering with nuclear facilities dropped exponentially after 1986. And the reports then became more observational surveillance type activities than any kind of interface. So my unpopular opinion became, perhaps they weren't, trying to send us signals, as many people like to think that, the turning off or turning on or interference with the electronic of nuclear operations was somehow intended to be a sign from NHI that either, they could actually control it and were in charge, or that they didn't like what we were doing. That it very well could be as simple as whatever they were using to assess our technology, right? Basically, our analog level technology. Perhaps it interfered and would cause these malfunctions and countdowns and turning on and turning off, right? Their Bluetooth and our Bluetooth didn't quite align in the right way. And if you put it in the 1986 context, Chernobyl, perhaps, again, there was an interference of the technology meeting. The people in the control room, human factor, didn't obviously wouldn't have known it, but didn't do the right things. It causes a major meltdown, and those doing the observing say, whoa, we can't let that happen again. Stick to observing. Don't try to interface systems or get into their systems anymore, because it causes more problems than we need. Again, unpopular theory, because people like to lean towards the, no, they were proving to us that they don't like nukes in what we're doing. So, but I stick by it.
Well, it's a different perspective. That's interesting to me. What do you think about this? Like people like Jake Barber and these people that are talking about controlling the craft and like summoning them and stuff like that, the CE5 type of stuff.
So, again, I've done a couple of deep dives into the CE5 and all the rest because obviously my father-in-law's work talks about consciousness and talks about the interface and the role that consciousness plays in it. Um, so I think there's a lot of value in exploring that. I think again there a likelihood exists of people who generally practice meditation and things like that, perhaps um, feeling, being able to tap into this information energy field, so to speak, like, because again, for my father in law's work, I have to accept, yeah, that's a thing
Mm-hmm.
that they can do that. Um, when they start speaking of it in terms of entertainment, oh, let's have a big woohoo in the desert and go out there and let's all call UFOs and dog whistles and things like that. Um, I tend to be more skeptical because, again, number one, if people are paying for something, paying for an experience, then that experience has to be delivered. And so I think that leads, without the proper controls, that can become problematic. Um, I've asked many people who are practitioners to sort of explain, and they give some okay explanations. I sort of question again the utility of the idea. There are advanced beings in advanced spacecraft, so they're just like sitting around a room waiting for a human to make contact with them, and they go responding to it. Like they're just flying around joyriding, and they pick up your cosmic signal of, oh, come show yourself to me, and they're like, oh, okay, here we are. Like they've
The
got to
problem,
have
the
other
problem,
stuff they're doing.
yeah, the problem I've always had with it is it's like okay, if they're these beings that have this advanced technology, or they have, or they're you know from a different dimension or whatever it is, that they have, like, now how come all of a sudden they're subservient to any person who follows this protocol to call them down, like they're like a genie in a lantern or
Genie in a
whatever,
bottle,
you know what
right?
I mean? It's like that.
Now, somebody explained it to me this way. They said, well, what they were told by the aliens was that it was this outpouring of positive energy that catches their attention, and they say, oh, I have to go see what this is all about. This is such an amazing thing these humans are sending out there. Let's go take a look at it and check it out. Again, you know, I I I I tend, I tend to have just I guess just an overly pragmatic view when it comes to this stuff, right? Like these craft, they have to be doing something, right? They're going from point A to B to C because they have a mission that they have to do, right? They have a purpose for being wherever they are. Um, so this idea that we're just signaling and they show up, I mean, it's almost like, truckers, right? So if we imagine, truckers on particular routes, all of a sudden start going left and right and stopping and making side visits because somebody's, out in the field with a flashlight,
Hmm.
or somebody gets on the CB and is like, "Hey, I'm 3 miles to your west," and they go, "Oh, okay. Instead of doing this job that I have to do, I'm going to go 3 miles to the west so they can see me, and
But
then I'm going
yeah,
to come back."
but of course, if they're less like us, in that way of like, doing jobs and being pragmatic and things like that, then I could see how they could show up for people, um, because those people had somehow gotten in the same, vibrational
Frequency,
state or
yeah.
whatever like that. The problem I have is that they seem is that the way that like Jake Barber and people like that put it is like, we're able to like call them in and then shoot them down. You know what I mean? Yeah,
Right,
like
right.
use some sort of there. That's what he was saying, and other people have said that the government is able to like, the government has psychics that are able to call these craft in, and then when the craft comes in, then they're like hit them with some kind of energy weapon, and then that downs them.
Right.
And to me that just seems like so like primitive and so like how many times are you going to fall for that? You know what I mean? Yeah.
I mean, again, there's lots of, there was somebody else with the psionics who talked about, connecting with the craft, and he got the direct message in his head to put his dog away. And so he
Hmm.
put the dog away, and then they actually landed and they appeared, and he's got this weird video of all of these shapes that are morphing, and he dissects how they're giving him these symbols as they're doing this with him. And then he like went out to these rocks and he found these same symbols on the rocks. But I'm like, but if they could telepathically communicate with you to put your dog away, then why, once they were right there, did they go into playing cosmic charades and giving you codes and symbols to go into the desert to find more codes and symbols? If they told
Also,
you to put the
there
dog away, why didn't they just tell you everything else they
right.
wanted to tell you?
Also, there are literally thousands of, maybe tens of thousands of reports of people over the years having interactions with them where they are able to uh, really like freeze a person, in mid stance. You know what I mean?
Right.
Take you and levitate you out of your bed at night and all that. So they're afraid of a dog. They can't stop a dog. They're
I,
able,
I
yeah.
and
It
it's
doesn't
why I
make
said
sense
when
to
I
me.
get asked the question about do I think there's a galactic federation? I don't know if there's a galactic federation. If one exists, it's a hot mess. It can't prescribe one set of rules for everybody to be following, or if it did prescribe one set of rules for everybody to follow, nobody seems to be following them. So, so
Hmm.
I don't know. I mean, again, all information's good information, but find a lot of it just to be contradictory, which just speaks to the complexities of the issue and the information that we need to get.
Well, like, yeah, with interactions like close encounters, abduction phenomenon, and things like that, I tend to think it's what it looks like to me, and sometimes, and my opinions go back and forth on things, but what it looks like to me sometimes is something that like I could compare to like a mystical experience or a religious experience to some degree, where people can have what could very possibly be the same experience, and then filtered through their cultural lens or filtered through their, who they are as an individual, then they end up reporting something, very different from one another, you know,
Exactly. Yeah.
and maybe that could be what's going on as far as like what the beings like, with this galactic federation and stuff like that you hear, like, maybe this is something that has been, this is the information that has been imparted on people, but the people like have taken, and sometimes you don't even know that you're doing that,
Yeah.
like you're putting your own spin on it, because, and relating it to something that maybe you we're already somewhat familiar with. Like that, the Betty and Barney Hill abduction kind of comes to mind to me because a lot of people say that, like, skeptics have always said that compared her description of the beings to the ones that had appeared like a week or two before on Outer Limits TV series, right?
Right.
And then the beings that they talked to pointed to a star map and said that we're from here or whatever. So, like, is that is that really what happened? I'm not saying that something didn't happen, but is that the people is that the beings that she really saw, or is that the only way that she could somehow come to grips with that, wrap her brain around it enough in order to relate it to other people?
And we can extrapolate that, or take that back to the ancient alien theories, and chariots in the sky and dragons, and firebirds and everything else. People,
Mm-hmm.
and I say it with the same thing with my father-in-law's work. He is using the language that is available to him at the time and his education in order to describe and detail the things that he is looking at.
Mm-hmm.
And so it just has to be placed within the context of the time that they're doing it, and the culture and environments that they're in. That's why what you just described. It's why I love those Saturday Night Live skits with Kate McKinnon. Um,
Yeah, yeah,
if you've ever seen that, where
yeah.
she's sort of the redneck on the abducted, and
The
there's always
support
somebody
groups.
else who had a wonderful experience, but hers wasn't so good.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
most of them are always reported as being very positive experiences, and that's what, uh, you know, I tend to be more suspicious of government and intelligence people because I see them framing it in a certain way, and a lot of times it's,
Absolutely.
particularly it's been framed in a way of as a threat and as a as really framing it in a way without saying it outright that all these things are that you're seeing are something from China, something from Russia. This is a threat. These are things that it's advanced technology that they're so we need more money. And that's kind of what it
Exactly.
comes to looks like to me. But when you get out of the sphere of the intelligence community and the a lot of the sort of like so-called whistleblowers. I don't really call them whistleblowers because, I mean, if you're Lou Elizondo or somebody, you're asking the government, can I say every word that you say? You're having it
Right.
approved by people above you. It's not really a whistleblower. You're just a mouthpiece for the government at that point. But
Agree.
when they do that, when they put that out there, it's like it's so vastly different. Like their assessment of the situation seems to be so vastly different than people who have just regular everyday people who have had experiences with this phenomenon for 70, 80 years or whatever. They're you almost never hear of like I mean, there was that brief period in the late 80s, mid to late 80s, after Whitley Strieber published the book Communion and follow up Transformation, where his experience was like this terrifying you know experience, this abduction experience is very terrifying. So right after that book was published, you got a lot of people that were doing like hypnotic regressions and things like that, and then you saw more of that, where they're having a terrifying experience or whatever. But really, other than that one bump right there, and I could easily chalk a lot of that up to the same thing as the satanic panic, where you have some of these therapists and stuff are whether they're knowingly or unknowingly implanting something into these people's minds, or whether it's just the cultural milieu or whatever is that's in it. But other than that, it's always been a very positive thing, and that's why you have so much new age sort of thought come out of it, and so many sort of groups that are like cults and things like that, that like the contactee groups that a lot of people would call cults back in the day, George Van Tassel and people like that, who would, he was the original contact in the desert guy. He had all the
Right.
people who would come out to the desert and they would look for them and he would give messages from them and stuff like that. And it was always this sort of like, very hippie, like Space Brothers, positive, anti-nuclear war, pro-environment, that type of message, and for
Right.
them, and I would say that's probably 90% of it or something, is that until you get to the government, and then all of a sudden it's a threat.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that, and that's exactly what led me to, again, start putting together for myself, or trying to discern for myself what is actually tangible, what conclusions can really be made upon whatever the best evidence is. What is exactly evidence versus theory, versus just ideas. Um, what is what is legitimate research into an aspect of the phenomenon versus a recycled and rebranded version of mysticism or new age science, or something else, because I see quite a bit of that the people who have taken something old and esoteric and replaced whatever it was in the 1920s with the word alien, and now all of a
Mm-hmm.
sudden it's a new thing again. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so it's out there, whether people want it, or want to look for it, or they just enjoy being part of the experience that they think they're having. That's great too. So again,
Mm-hmm.
I don't seek to rain on anybody's parade. I'm just putting out what I find for those who are seeking that level of discernment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's a big, there, for, and I think just this is a very recent phenomenon, really, that there's a very big umbrella under which a lot of things are falling, and they're calling them UFO/UAP, but a lot of this can be very different things. But I think that what you're doing, what you've done with this book, um, Engineering Infinity, and what you've done with that is something that really needs to be done, because it isn't a blind spot for a lot of people that we don't really know a lot about the Soviets and their technology and their ARV programs or crash retrieval programs or anything like that. And putting that out there as a technical work, and then just having that just be something that people can dissect for years to come is a really valuable thing, I think.
Oh, thanks. And that's again why we did it, why we put it out, because in everything I was looking at, there was nothing that you could conclusively land on and say, well, what can I compare this against? Right? Nothing. Everything in this book, everything in these works is falsifiable. So if you want to take it and you have the skills to do it,
Mm,
um, it's there. Go for it. I say it all the time. Falcon Space, Mark Sokol, they reference it. They've been referencing it, for a few months now, and I guess there's some things in there that made them think of things differently. Whatever. Look, I don't need to be involved. I don't need to show up. I don't need to, have anything. I just tell them, if you win a Nobel Prize, let me know when the party is. Right? Give me a call. I'd love to come see a result from it.
yeah, it could
And that's why
be a
we put
plus
it all
one.
out there. Yeah. Well, that's why we put it out there the way we put it out there. It's like, look, here it is. It's a utility. It's a reference. Use it however you can use it. What I'm putting out is what I am finding. Go challenge it. Go look it up yourself. If you want to prove me wrong, prove me wrong. It's all the same materials there, right? I've had a couple of people, actually, I think it was somebody who was actually trying to disprove it, wound up finding additional new information that reinforced it, even more, was actually quite helpful.
Yeah.
They actually found my father-in-law back in 2012 had tried publishing this himself in on Russian social media. that he had put it all out there, sort of on a kind of Facebook type platform that they had, because he was mad about a change in a treason law that Putin had done in 2012 that was putting scientists that worked in these same domains in jail for. So essentially, if you can imagine, scientists work in this domain. After the fall of the Soviet Union, they start working with Western universities and they start doing conferences. And they're not talking about UFOs, but they're talking about the science
Mm-hmm.
around it, which a lot of it fits in with advanced propulsion and exotic material
Mm-hmm.
sciences. And then in 2012, Putin writes a new law that says, "Oh, remember 1997? You did that conference? Yeah, that was treason, and now
Oh
you're
wow,
76 years old and going to jail."
retroactive
So,
treason. Huh?
right. So my father-in-law, being in Kazakhstan and outside the reach of Russia proper, took all of this work and he essentially said, "Now it's all out there because people were like, oh, this is dangerous." So it's the first thing that we found where we can actually refer to some of his direct comments on the work, and it gives us a little bit of insight into his mind and his motivations and the things that were important to him, and the things he was angry about, with Gorbachev, through Putin. Uh, and that was from somebody who was trying to originally be like, all right, let me see if this guy's full of shit, on me. And he actually found more supporting information. And he came back. He's like, and it was something we had never found. So it actually helped. So that's why I say go for it,
That's
challenge
cool.
it,
Yeah.
dive into it. We don't know what we're going to find.
Yeah. The importance is it is falsifiable. Um, but I appreciate you being here, and that's definitely fascinating stuff. I'll put a link in the description where you can purchase the book, and yeah, that's a lot. That's a lot to unpack. I'll definitely keep an eye on it.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it. Yeah, so it's engineeringinfinitybook.com. Again, you don't even have to buy the book. There's links there to another archive file where every page of the individual scans are there, that people can download the individual scans of each page. The book itself, again, it's the hardcover or soft cover, I should say, but hard print of the scan with the translation. We're working on a new set of translations, a tighter set, now that we have some actual people with scientific backgrounds who have come forward who are Russian speaking and understand some of the intricacies of the translation. So we're working on an update of that. So, yeah, like I said, there's a PDF, there's I'm sorry, flip book version right on the website you can look through of the entire manuscript. You can get the hard copy. You can download a PDF of it, or you can go frame by frame and download the individual screenshots, if you want. We try to make as many avenues as possible available for people to have access to the materials and store them for themselves and work with them however they can.